Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick Allen. We're not in studio because of the COVID-19 situation, so we're sort of bootlegging it via Skype. Joining me today is Tony Clement, former Ontario Minister of Health, Federal Minister of Industry, and President of the Federal Treasury Board. So thank you so much, Tony, for joining me.
My pleasure.
Thank you. A lot of us are wondering now, when are we ever going to go back to work? When are children going to go back to school? Do we see any end to this self-isolation now that we see across many provinces they've extended the return to school date for children till the beginning of May, perhaps indefinitely? What's your sense on the ground?
Well, are we going to get back to something resembling normal at some point? Yes. But the issue is when and by what degree. And clearly, it was overly optimistic to think that at the beginning of April or even middle of April, things would be back on the rails. It's clearly not any earlier than the end of April and into May. And according to John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, at the end of June. So I think that everybody's just sort of grasping at straws right now, trying to figure out what the end point is. To me, the interesting question is not what is the end point. If your end point is that there are zero new cases and zero fatalities for an extended period of time, we may never get to that end point. So to me, the interesting issue is, when do we start having the debate about what is acceptable in terms of the pandemic versus the state of our economy and the state of our society? Because there are so many human costs to lockdown. There are human costs in terms of people being exposed to domestic violence. There are human costs in terms of drug addiction. There are, of course, human costs associated with lack of work and the suicides that brings. And of course, the long-term damage to the economy and the ability of our kids and grandkids to think of a better life for themselves. So at some point, I'm not trying to be a downer here, but at some point that debate has to occur, because if the end point is zero new cases, we may never get to zero new cases.
Right. And we've seen with the economy, the markets, they hit some kind of bottom. I don't know if that's the absolute bottom, but they hit a low and then they bounced back. So it's sort of been all over the place. A lot of that has to do with obviously optimism and hope, as we've seen the government throw all sorts of cash at the markets, to people basically through EI programs and incentives and throwing a lot of money around. I guess the question is, how long is that sustainable? Be it the 75% wages that the government's now going to be covering for business owners, or the $2,000 a month federal EI that people who aren't even generally eligible for EI are able to claim. How long can that sustain?
Well, I think that's a very legitimate question, and a number of economists and thinkers are trying to figure that out, because we are in untested territory. We really are. And the last time we had, sort of whole of government response like this, it was World War II, but it was a very different society. World War II, mm-hmm. a lot more were self-caring rather than relying on government. So I don't think anybody has a realistic answer to that. I would note, as of this broadcast, that Parliament is being recalled to deal with another situation, to deal with the bailout situation of individuals and businesses, obviously. And clearly, what was passed by Parliament just a few days ago is no longer sufficient tomorrow. So
right.
I don't know where the bottom is for that. I don't know when gravity takes hold and when things start to fray. We're starting to see some societal fraying in Europe right now. There are riots going on and looting going on in southern Italy, for example. So none of us want to see that. None of us want to see that in Canada. So right now, I gotta give some defense to the federal government, because this has never happened before like this. And so, I know there's some criticism. Oh, you're bringing Parliament back already. Well, things have changed already in a week. So unless somebody has perfect forward vision, there's going to be a lot of ad hocery going on.
Yeah, it's definitely a fluid situation. And you mentioned these times are pretty much unprecedented. World War II was similar. Even when you were the Minister of Health dealing with the SARS crisis, I don't recall there being widespread layoffs and businesses shutting down. Obviously, there were precautions taken, but not to this degree in terms of self-isolation. And still, I think we're still on the upward trajectory of numbers. We haven't even hit our climax. So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. I don't like that expression, but it's actually what we all have to do. We have to be patient, keep in contact with people. You mentioned there are suicide rates and a lot of depression, especially I think with the elderly. I think they're feeling very alone. They can't see their grandkids or their neighbors. It's a challenge. So thanks again for your insight, Tony, and
Thank you.
probably talking with you again next week.
Stay safe.
Okay, thank you so much. Once again,
Thank
that
you.
was Tony Clement, former Minister of Health for Ontario, Federal Treasury Board President, and Minister of Industry with lots of insights. So stay safe, everybody. We'll be back next week with an update.